While InDesign can be used for making on-screen interactive files, for most of us, it all comes down to one thing. Can we get this thing to print? And the answer, of course, is yes. To do that, I'll go to the File menu and choose Print. Up comes the Print dialog box, and there are a lot of features in here. I'm not going to cover all of them, but I do want to point out the most important ones. The first thing we need to do, of course, is choose the proper printer from the Printer pop-up menu. This lets us tell InDesign where we're going to be printing. Then, of course, you can choose the number of copies, what page range you want to be printing. I want to print all the pages in my document, and I want to print these as spreads, not individual pages. You can see the difference down here in the lower left corner. That's where we see a print preview. This document is a trifold brochure, where each panel of the brochure was set up as an individual page, so I need to print it as a single spread, not individual pages. Okay, next I'm going to click on the Setup pane over here. I can tell by looking at this print preview that these document pages are not going to print on my current paper size. So I better change the paper size. That's this pop-up menu here. This means the paper that's actually in the printer, what I'm actually printing on. I'll put this on some really big paper, maybe A3. Now, here I could tell this to scale to fit if I want to, but in this case I don't want to. I'm going to leave it set to 100%. I can also change the orientation here. I could print it straight up or sideways. I'd like to print this in the middle of the page, though, so I'm going to change the Page Position pop-up menu to Centered. Next, I'll head over to the Marks and Bleed pane. I'm going to turn on all my printer marks right now. You don't necessarily have to have all these checkboxes on, but it does add your crop marks and your bleed marks, your color bars, all kinds of good stuff. But if you are using marks, I encourage you to come over here to the Offset field and increase this value a little bit. I'm going to make this 12 points. Because 6 points, in my opinion, is just too close to the page. Because this document has bleed in it, that is, there's objects that bleed off the side of the page, we need to make sure that we turn on the Use Document Bleed Settings feature. That way, InDesign will print anything that falls within the bleed guide settings. Now, I happen to know that this document also has some information in the slug area, so I better turn that on as well. You'll see in the preview that it just added a little bit of space on the top of the page. By turning that checkbox on, the information that's out in that area will get printed, even though later it's going to get trimmed off. Now, in the Output pane of the Print dialog box, we can change the color. In most cases, you're going to be printing composite CMYK to a color printer. But if you're printing to a grayscale printer, you might change this to composite gray. That way, everything gets changed to grayscale. And in that case, you might also want to turn on the Text as Black checkbox. That way, all of your text will automatically be set to black. You'll be able to read it better. The other option I want to point out in this pop-up menu is Composite RGB. If your final output is going to an inkjet printer or a desktop laser printer, then you might want to treat it as an RGB device and choose RGB here. I know there's CMYK ink or toner in these printers, but those kinds of inexpensive desktop printers tend to print better when you treat them as RGB devices. Now, of course, if you're printing on a printing press or a digital printer, you definitely want to use CMYK. Next, I'm going to head over to the Advanced pane. Right now, the Transparency Flattener preset is set to Medium. And if you're just printing a quick proof, then Medium's fine. But any final quality artwork should definitely be printed with high resolution, not medium. Now, before I click Print, there are two more things I want to talk about. One is that if you've done all this work to set up the Print dialog box once, you're probably going to want to use the same settings again, right? So, save them as a preset. All you have to do is click the Save Preset button. InDesign will ask you what you want to call it. I'm going to call this David's Preset. You can call it anything you want, and then I'll click OK. When I do that, you'll see it immediately adds it to my Print Preset pop-up menu up here. Now, anytime I want these same settings, I can just choose that out of the pop-up menu. The other thing I should point out is, if your printer has specific features that InDesign doesn't know about, then click on the Printer button down here. Now, InDesign is going to warn you that many of the things in the Printer Driver dialog box will be overridden by InDesign's own dialog box. That's fine. I'll click OK. Now, this is the Printer Driver dialog box. It's going to look very different on Windows, of course, but this is where you set up your printer-specific features. I like to click Show Detail so I can see all my options, but in this case, all I'm going to do is turn on Two-Sided. To close this dialog box, I click Print, and InDesign returns me to InDesign's own Print dialog box. By the way, if you're printing to a non-PostScript printer, like an inexpensive desktop inkjet or a laser printer, a number of the features inside this dialog box may not be available at all. But that's okay. InDesign prints pretty well to those kinds of printers too. Well, I think we're good to go. Time to click print.